I was born in 1939. My dad was principal at Prospect High School. He was an elementary principal prior to that, and he had gone to McKendree College in Illinois because that was the only place that American Indians could be accepted in school. And how he got there, he was a member of the Methodist Church here in Pembroke, and there was a man from the Methodist, some Methodist headquarters came down and gave a missionary speech, and my father was in the audience. And he said, is there any way I might go to school? Because he couldn't go to Carolina or Duke or anywhere like that based on race. And my dad was a real scholarly, nerdy kind of guy. That was his personality, dry wit, dry humor, that kind of thing. And this guy said, yes, I can work it out. So he ended up in McKendree College, which is how we get the name Old Main, because there was a building on that campus named Old Main. And later on in my dad's career, they allowed him to name our building here Old Main. So I grew up here on the campus. I arrived when I was 6 months old, and my dad had built his new bride a house, and it was on Front Street, West Front Street in Pembroke. But they never spent a night there because once he took the job here, and there are two jobs that he was offered. He was to be a school superintendent in South Dakota for the Sioux Indians, and that job came through the Bureau of Indian Affairs, or he could take this job here in Pembroke to be the dean here at the college. And my mother was from Union Chapel, and she said, no way am I going to an Indian reservation with my baby to live. So that kind of took care of that. And so then my dad took this job here. And once he took the job, they said, now you realize you have to stay in the first house on Faculty Row, which is just in front of the infirmary that is here. So that's where we lived, and there were 5 houses on that row, and at the end of that row were 5 metal garages. So our house was the first, my dad was the dean. Second house was the chancellor's house. Third house was Dr. Todd's, who was a history professor. Fifth house was Dr. Kennedy, who worked in agricultural. And upstairs there were 5 maiden ladies that worked on the campus. One taught art, one was a librarian, Miss Knable, that ran the library here. One taught school. She was a primary education teacher. So that was the lay of the campus. There was on the campus, there was a girls' dorm, a boys' dorm, a cafeteria, a little stadium where they had football and baseball. There was a gym, there was a tennis court, and there was a big water tower. So that was the buildings that were an administration building. So that was the buildings that were on the campus when I came. By the time I was about 3, when my mother took an afternoon nap, I found that you can unlatch the screen door and you could wander all over the campus. And sometime when she got up from her nap, I would be in a class somewhere, dressed maybe appropriate or maybe inappropriate. Then I would get a spanking. But it was just like, this campus was like a playground. Later, there was a girl whose father was the groundskeeper, Walter Pinchbeck. Mary Alice came on campus, and then later she had other siblings. She had 4 other siblings that were born, but my brother was born in 1942, and he was the first Indian child born on this campus, delivered at the house on Faculty Road by Dr. R.D. McMillan. So then there was the 5 Pinchback kids, the 2 Oxendine kids, my brother and I. Then Dr. Kennedy had 2 children. They were Caucasian, and they attended schools in Red Springs. The bus came through the campus, picked them up, transported them to school each day. Mary Alice and her brother and my brother, we just jumped the ditch bank and went about where the administration building is now. It was where our elementary school was. When we went to high school, I went out my back door, went past the chancellor's house to the yellow brick building that's being renovated now, and that's where I went to high school. So my world was pretty well contained. Farthest I went was to Fayetteville, and that was a big shopping outing. We would go to Lumberton, and you should note that during those times, there were no restrooms for American Indians. So if you went to Lumberton, let's say your mom was out shopping, Dad had the responsibility of staying in the car with us, then we need to use the bathroom. There's no bathroom, because he's not going to allow us to go in the, at that time, Negro restrooms, and we're not allowed in the Caucasian restrooms, which they call white. So we'd have to have a quart jar in the car to use the bathroom. Same with my mother's doctor was Dr. R.D. McMillan, who delivered both myself and my brother. And I was born on the farm about a mile from here off of Highway 710 at the home place where my father eventually built a home. But when she'd go to the doctor in Red Springs, let's say I'd want an ice cream cone because I'd been very good. She's filling a prescription. Or maybe I wanted a Coke because they had those chairs that had the little sweetheart back shaped like a heart. And you had got a straw with it. And we were not allowed to sit at any of those tables. We could buy an ice cream cone, we could buy a candy bar, but we could not be seated anywhere. And so that was just kind of alarming to me as a child to kind of go through that. Well, I want to go back to the campus life. Things that we did on the campus, the children, I'm talking about things that the children did. We jumped ditches, we climbed trees. The boys climbed the water tower. One time my brother got up there and could not get down, and we had to get the security man to go up there and bring him down. And of course, he got a big spanking. We raked straw for playhouses. We picked up pine cones. There were briarberries growing on the railroad tracks, which we call blackberries. We'd pick those at random. We'd pick them. We would pick magnolia blossoms, climb up in a tree and get those and bring them home. Dr. Kennedy grew a lot of interesting vegetables, and so we learned to grow broccoli, and that was new to us. I had never seen the flower nasturtium. I'd never seen a flower sweet pea. Janet, who later became a doctor, raised rabbits, and so we saw rabbits breeding and little baby rabbits and big rabbits, and so that was just a wonderful experience. They had a record player, which we did not have at our house, and so I heard Peter and the Wolf. I heard other little classic children's stories at their house. And interestingly enough, they always set the table with napkin rings. We never had napkin rings at our house. Now, our house was a 3-bedroom home, a living room, dining room, kitchen, and a boiler room. So we had radiators in all the houses, and you had to stoke the boiler to make sure you had heat in your home. The living room at our house always had to be clean, because on off days when my dad was not in the office, if a student wanted to enroll in school or learn about it or tour the campus, they'd come to our house and knock on the door. So soon as you entered our house was a living room, so it had to be kept pristine clean all the time, because you didn't know who was going to be at that door. So we played out in the yard a lot, and in the bedrooms, and in the kitchen, and on the back porch, because the idea was the dining room and living room needed to look good. So we learned that early on. When we got in trouble with our other little children on the street, or got in trouble at home, my mother would always quick go put the windows down, because she's going to spank us, and she doesn't want the chancellor to hear our spanking, because early on the chancellor lived next door, and so if you yelled loud enough, he would hear it. The chancellor at that time was, initially it was O'Brien, and he left, and then Dr. Wellens came, and that's who I remember. He was a missionary from India, and when his children came, they brought badminton sets. I learned to play badminton. I learned to play croquet. They brought croquet. Just learned many wonderful things from that exposure to that family, and they were so kind. At that time, the campus would have vespers for students. They'd have a religious week, and they'd have a lot of speakers, like E. Stanley Jones came one time and spoke in Old Main in the big auditorium. So we were exposed to a lot of things. My dad had to collect all the revenue at every event, be it sporting events, music events, or plays. So guess who got to tag along with him? My mother would say, "Why don't you go with your dad?" And then she'd have a little break. My mother loved to sew. My mother was a high school graduate. She had been a student of my father's at Pembroke High School. And he taught her French, and I don't know, I guess she took history under him, but a year after she finished high school, they married. So they married in 1934, and then I was born in 39. Now, I want to tell you some of the things that went on the campus. We would have in Old Main box suppers, where students would fix their best picnic food in a box, decorate it with ribbons and cellophane paper, and then you would go and bid on it, and whomever's box you bid on, you would then go with them to one of the classrooms and have your dinner with whomever it was that you bid on. And so that was a great experience. Going to all the sporting games was a great experience. Dr. Pinchback on Sundays would unlock the gym. That would have been against policy, but his children and Jerry and I and Janet and John could go in there and play all Sunday afternoon with all the equipment. They had a ping pong table, they had basketballs, they had a shuffleboard. We could do whatever we wanted because then we could run, we had races. So that was fun. Nobody else got to do that but us. We had sidewalks on the campus. So when all the town kids would get skates, they would come on the campus to skate. But prior to that, we were the only ones that were skating on the campus and running scooters up and down the sidewalks and things like that. So that was really fun for us. In front of our house, they had a maypole day where they had all the queens, and they were all in their long dresses. They had a maypole dance right in front of our house. Is where they were twirling the ribbons around the maypole. And just a lot of wonderful experiences. We're just outside our door, just out the door, and there you're at all these wonderful things. My dad played tennis. He was not a great athlete. He played a little football in college, but not good enough to be a starter. And I think he was a tackler, whatever that would be called. But when the picture came for him to be in the annual, the coach said, "Oxy, will you give your jersey to the quarterback? He left his at the dorm." So in the picture, my dad has a black t-shirt on and everybody else has lettered shirts. So that was really interesting. Because of his education in Illinois, he brought lots of wonderful, inspiring things back to us. He learned to eat tamales and loved them. So when we'd go to Fayetteville, he would find a Mexican place where we could get tamales because he loved that cornbread texture and he loved the meat filling. And so we learned about that. He encouraged us, because he could not dance in college, to learn how to dance. Because when he was in college, they take riverboat cruises, and one of his buddies had a car that had a rumble seat. And when he was dating, that's where he and his girlfriend would sit in the rumble seat. But they'd go on these cruises, and he could not dance. And the girl at that time that he was dating was always up dancing, wanting to dance, and he couldn't dance. So he said, "You must learn to dance." So that kind of gives you a little background of our life on the campus. I realized there were certain behaviors that could go on campus that could not go on outside campus. And that came really quickly to me because Janet and John, after the chancellor had a chancellor's house built, and they lived behind us at that point, I realized that Janet and John could not go to school with us, that a school bus came through, picked them up, and took them to Red Springs, and we were going locally. So all our teachers were Indian that were teaching us. So I realized that. And then if I went to downtown Pembroke, most of the merchants that owned businesses were Caucasian. Their clerks might be Indian, but there were not Indian-owned businesses. So you'd notice that right away. Churches were segregated. Janet and John went to Red Springs to church, and sometimes there was a white Presbyterian church on the other end of town they'd go to. We went just across the campus to Berea, so we could walk to church, and then later when we learned to drive, Daddy would let us warm up the car and drive to the front of the house, and then the family would be loading in the car to go to church, just right across the campus. So yeah, I was aware that something was a little different. At that time, there was only Indian students, and my dad I'll give him credit for two things. He did many marvelous things because he was my father and I just adored him. But naming Old Maid was one. The other was he increased the enrollment because he went out in the tobacco fields and the cotton fields and talked to the parents about letting their kids go to school. Now, my dad did not go to school until he was age 25. He finished high school at 25 because the Indian concept was if you had a big family, the children would work a year and go to school a year, and work a year, go to school a year. So he was 25 when he finished high school, 28 when he finished college. So many of the Indian parents were reluctant to give up their children to go to college when all they were going to do was to be a farmer. So he'd go down in the fields and he'd talk to them, and finally they'd agree that maybe they could drive into the campus and take their courses in the mornings so they could be home in the afternoons, or take in the afternoons so they could work the other hours. And the dorm only housed about 12 rooms for the women and about that many for the men. So they didn't have a dormitory to accommodate the people, but he was able to get the families to know that they could drop their kids off at the campus, they could go to school, they could come back and pick them up, they could go to the fields and work and bring them back the next day and they could go to class. And so that was a wonderful thing because I got to see a lot of people and like Kurt Locklear that his family now owns the True Value Hardware at the end of town. I watched them date because I had a girlfriend whose mother and father were Lumbee, and she was a cafeteria worker, and she was also in charge of the dorm. Their daughter, Carolyn, and I would play in the parlor of the girls' dormitory. We'd play Betty Grable because Wabash Avenue was out at that point. And so we'd be in there playing, and a young man would come to pick up his date, and we would watch them and hold hands. We'd watch them kiss. We just thought that's the funniest thing ever. And so we'd watch them all over the campus. Same thing with the boys at the door. The Coach Sampson, who married the chancellor's daughter from McKendree College, married his only daughter and brought her down in this Indian country. She didn't know a thing about Indians. And he was the coach. James Thomas Sampson was his name. They had a daughter named Sally. And Sally has just died, but she was married to a doctor at Duke. When they came, then Sally was on campus with us. So we had added Carolyn and we'd added Sally. And then R. Pate Lowry married Reba Lowry, and they were both professors here. And they had a daughter named Arleta, and Arleta would come on the campus, and she would play with us. And then later, much later, Dr. Herbert Oxendine had finished his doctorate in Boston, and they moved next to us at some point, and Linda Oxendine would be the elder of that family, Dr. Linda Oxendine. and there are, I think, about 5 children in that family. So we lived next to them a short time because we left the campus in 1957 because my father was retiring as dean and was moving to be a professor, and he became a history and sociology professor from 57 until 1970. And so he had finally built a second dream house for my mother, and so we left the campus and I was a junior in college. Spring of my junior year, we left the campus to move to the farm. And my dad preached the value of education all the time in our house, but to see all these people in college with college books and being cheerleaders and being athletes and dating and walking, strolling around the campus and going to sporting events, it was so encouraging. I couldn't think of any other way that one was supposed to live their life. So yeah, it did have a profound impact. Just the fact that I felt comfortable walking in these classrooms, walking in any of the buildings, walking in, well, we were not supposed to do it, but we walked. The kids, sometimes they'd have to tell us, get out of the building, because we literally thought, okay, we could go in the restrooms in that building. We know where the water fountain is. You know, we're just roaming around. Mary Alice and I don't know what age we were, but I'll say 11 or 12, climbed up the back stairs and got on top of Old Main. And she had stolen some cigarettes from her daddy and some snuff from her grandmother. We got up there and got sick trying to smoke a cigarette and use snuff. And then we had to come back down. Of course, we had upset stomachs and we got in just a heap of trouble for that. But I mean, there were constantly little stuff like that going on. We'd play tag in the buildings, Old Main. Sometimes we were running, there were the auditorium, and then there were 2 hallways. So you could run down one hallway, run out, turn, get back on the other hallway, come out. It was just, we were just undisciplined, I guess. But anyway, we were having a grand life on this campus. My dad said, where you work, that's where you go to school. And I wanted to go to Meredith. And at that time, I had finished high school in '56, so I could have entered Meredith. At that time, they had eliminated the rule that no Indians or nobody other than Caucasians could go. So I could have gone to Meredith. My grades were good, but my dad said, no, you'll just get up there, and there's all those state students, and you just will get in trouble. You're going to school here. So I went all my years here to school, and my last year I had to ride from the farm into campus every day with my father, who would say, did you do your homework for Professor da-da-da-da-da? Because you were late getting home last night, and so-and-so said you had not turned a paper in. And so this is our conversation in the car coming down to the college every day. So yeah, I didn't have a car, so I came with my dad here. And before I was on the campus going to school, I needed something, I'd run home and get it. I'm right here. This was like an oasis of knowledge. People would come, if they were getting married, they'd come have wedding pictures taken on the campus. People would come and stroll around. If you were dating, you'd come and stroll here on Sundays with your girlfriend or boyfriend or skate. It was well revered in the community, really revered. It was a leader in the community, more so than the town council or the mayor. It was the happening place for any sporting event, for any play, for any musical program. It was well respected. Well, at the time that I went to school, you could measure in education. And I don't remember what other, but maybe 3 or 4 other things. I know as an Indian female, I could have been a beautician, I could have been a farmer's wife, I could have been a nurse, I could have been a teacher, I could have been a stay-at-home mom. Those were my career options. pretty limiting because really I aspired to go to Broadway. That was my ultimate dream. And Miss Knable helped me with that because, let me divert a little and go back. When I was a teenager, she hired me for 50 cents an hour, and I would put pockets in the library, books, and stamp them on page 13 and 33 and 23 and so on. Later, she taught me how to shelf the books. Later, she taught me how to use the library catalog. So I knew all of that stuff before I was in high school, how to research and find things. We had no magazines or newspapers in our house because our family came to the library and we read the magazines and looked at the magazines. So I had looked at National Geographic. I had looked at Look magazine and Life magazine. I knew where the newspaper racks were. My dad was always reading things, and he was a big reader. My father was really a great reader, even until he died at 87. He was checking out books and reading. Back to your original question about what inspired me. My dad was administration. I met my husband here. I met him. He was taking drama classes, and he was Reverend Bob Mangum's brother. And Bob Mangum was a pastor at the Methodist Church. Caucasian man came in. His sole purpose was to be a minister at an Indian church. So he and his wife moved to Pembroke, and so I met my husband here. We were in drama classes. I loved drama, and I loved plays. I was in plays all through high school. I loved cheerleading, playing, all that kind of stuff, being in plays, and we were cast opposites, so that's how I got to meet him. Now, I chose to, my degree was in education, so I finished in '60, and I had an option to go to Virginia Beach, San Diego, New York, Michigan. So I wanted to go to San Diego, and my father said, "No, you can't." And I thought, well, you're supposed to honor your father. I didn't know that I could say, absolutely, I will go. I had a job out there, and I had seen pictures of San Diego, and if I'd ever gone, I'd have never come home. It was the most beautiful place in the world. My father agreed that I could go to Michigan, Detroit, which is cold and gloomy, and but the reason was I had a cousin teaching at school up there. So he said, you could live with Mag, and this would be a safe environment because there's nobody for you in New York, there's nobody for you in Virginia Beach, there's nobody for you in San Diego, but Mag could look after you. Now Magnolia Griffin was a teacher here at the university. Anyway, well, I didn't want my cousin to look after me, but anyway, I took a job in Michigan, and I taught school there. And then my husband and I were married. He was in broadcast, and so we were married the next spring here at Berea. And then we moved to Port Huron. I taught school there. Then we left Port Huron, went to Otsego. I taught school in Otsego, Michigan. Then we went to Battle Creek, Michigan. I taught school in Battle Creek, Michigan. At this point, we had a child, our first child. Then moved to Lincoln, Nebraska. This was all the broadcast moves. So went to Lincoln, Nebraska, and had our second child, a son. And we left Lincoln and went to Salina, Kansas to Sioux City, Iowa, and Sioux City, Iowa, back to Raleigh. So I had said when we got married, since it was a mixed marriage, that I would never raise a child of mine in North Carolina. We had agreed that it was not a harmonious place to raise a mixed race child because things were still pretty segregated in many ways. So we moved to North Raleigh, and he took a job in Raleigh, and I took a job in Raleigh. And I was closer, at that point I was closer home. I was 2 hours away from seeing my mom and dad, 2 hours away from seeing his brother and his family who were here and stayed in this community. And So then I started teaching school in Wake County. I taught 1 year in Wake County, and then I moved to the Department of Public Instruction, become the Director of Indian Education for the state of North Carolina. And that's where I stayed until I retired in '96. So I worked for state my degree was in administration, and I prefer working with children, but I found if you want to change policy, you have got to work with adults, because they're the ones making policy. And I learned that from my dad. And he said to me, "Are you sure you want to do this? Because there's a lot of headaches in it." He said, "You're going to have to make hard decisions if you're an administrator. If you're a professor, you just do what someone said you ought to do and stay within those guidelines. But if you're an administrator, you have to step out, you have to lead, and sometimes your decisions are well received, and sometimes you get a lot of negative feedback." But anyway, I went into administration, and I loved it, and I really enjoyed my career, and I was quite good in my career. I did a lot of interesting things. I was able to get Ivy's department store to commission a plate that was done in England of Indians. I was able to get McDonald's to do tray liners for focus on Indians in the state of North Carolina. I was able to get a book written about Indians. So I was able to, from that position, I was able to leverage that into some very positive things for Indian people, and I enjoyed it. And I did enjoy teaching, and I did have in Iowa, I had the best option of a career I'd had prior to becoming a state administrator. I was a self-image development person for 2 schools that were predominantly Black and Indian, where I worked on increasing the self-image of children. And that was a grant from the state of Iowa allowed that to happen. And that was a very successful, good, fulfilling career choice at that time. And I did enjoy it, and I hated leaving it. But once I got into administration, I realized that is where you can change policies. That is where you can influence people for the good or the bad, because you're a leader. And I get that from both my mother and father were leaders, but she aspired to be a homemaker and a seamstress, but she could have been a clothes designer, because she sewed all my clothes, and she'd go to McNair's store and sketch out something that she wanted to make for me and come home and use a paper bag and cut a pattern and sew it. So she even sewed my wedding dresses. She sewed all the attendance dresses. She was quite accomplished at that. And on the campus, she had to learn how to give a tea, and she came from a very poor, impoverished situation. And Miss Knable said, "I have a book on teas," because the dean's wife has to host teas, and showed her how to lay out a tea table and what kind of tablecloth to have and what kinds of foods to prepare and all of that. I love this university, and I love the campus, and I come back and I marvel at the growth. I just am unbelievably amazed at the growth at this campus that started as just an Indian school. I'm just amazed. And all the chancellors have done a wonderful, wonderful job. Robin is a great chancellor. My cousin Joe Oxendine was a great chancellor. And they all bring their own vision. A leader brings their own vision to a task. When you're giving a job, you can bring your own influence into that job to create what you want to create. And it's just necessary to have people work with you to get that done. And I found that is true. After I retired, I became a county commissioner of Wake County, and I aspired. Initially, I told you I wanted to go to Broadway, and I never made that, so then I decided I'll aspire to have a political career. So I had planned, I ran for Wake County Commissioner, won easily, lost on the second time because I raised taxes 1 penny for schools. I ran on a school platform. So I got beat up and lost that. So then I thought I will go to the Senate, the North Carolina Senate. And I was prepared to do that, at which time Al decided we're going to retire in Pinehurst. So that took care of that. So then I retired to Pinehurst, and I'm a staunch Democrat. My dad was a Democrat, my parents were a Democrat, and I guess you could say when I die I will be one. And I believe so much in helping the poor and helping people find their way. I don't believe so much in handouts, but I believe in a hand up. Get people on their feet. The wonderful thing about being a Lumbee is we had to earn our own way, build our own schools, make our mark in this world, learn how to grow our own crops and learn how to handle the money and build our own success. And there's something to be said for that. And that's different than what the life you get on a reservation. This community has benefited because of this university. It's taught the people that they can become a teacher, that they can become a successful farmer, that they can manage their own finances, that they can own a business. This university has done that, has lifted poverty from so many lives in this county. So many people that had no idea that they were even worthy of getting a college education got it because this university was willing to receive them and help them. If you got on campus and you needed counseling, or you needed tutoring, or you needed help with different lessons, or if you were struggling with time management, they could help teach you all of those things, how that you could be successful in that classroom. Just this university provided that opportunity. Well, it was so fun, such fun on that campus to be able to have relationships with the faculty. They knew me, they knew my brother, they knew Mary Alice, they knew all the little kids on the campus. And the professor that I loved was Reba Lowry. She was always a friend to me. Miss Knable, the librarian, was always a friend to me. She introduced me to books, and I was reading Tom Sawyer at a very early age because she exposed that and said, here, you ought to read this. This would be good. So the faculty was really, really kind to the children. They knew us by names because we're in and out their buildings, but they were not condescending. They were very encouraging and positive in their reaction to us and to me in particular. Miss Reba was a mentor of mine on campus, and she believed that I could go to Broadway. And I believed at that point that I could. I felt like I needed dancing, and I had no dancing, and to go to Broadway you need to dance and sing. I knew I could do the drama part, but I didn't have the dance experience. And then I fell in love, and then I had a different vision for what my life would be. But yeah, the professors in particular, Miss Reba, Miss Knable, Miss Reckendorf, I'm an artist now. She exposed me to all kinds of things in art and art media, and I could go up there and she'd show me different things. It was just marvelous. It was just marvelous. And even Walter Pinchback would let us ride on the back of his truck. He's a custodian, and they'd say now that's against the law. Well, we'd jump on the back of that truck, and we didn't have seatbelts or anything. We were hanging our legs off that truck, and we'd bounce around the campus while he was going to do something or other. We just thought it was great fun. Interesting thing about my mom is she had chickens on the campus. My dad said, no, we're not going to have chickens at the dean's house. And she said, oh, I love chickens, and we're going to have chickens, because she came from a very impoverished situation, one mother with 5 children, and the children had to learn to be share tenants. So she worked in a field like a man, because that's the only way they had to make a living. And so she had chickens, and she sold eggs, and she'd use that egg money to buy thread so she could sew. And there was a service station across the street where that Esso is now. and you could buy a bologna sandwich and a Pepsi and a nab for $0.25. That egg money came in handy, and we learned to appreciate those chickens. And if she wanted chicken, she just went out and got a chicken, killed it, cleaned it, and we raised chickens. We always got for Easter little chickens that had been dyed pink and blue, and they eventually became the chickens that we were going to be eating, and we did not like that, but we ate our pet chickens at some point in our life. There was a faculty club that once a month the faculty met and had a very, I'd say, formal dinner. And from time to time, some of the prize students would get invited. Maybe the president of student council would get invited to this. But they had informative and fun activities for faculty on campus. And this was their way to socialize and eat together. And the Wellenses always came around at Christmas and went to all the faculty on the campus, delivering presents and visiting. We were in and out of the chancellor's home. It was just a family feel. We didn't feel like there was any place that we could not go and were not welcome. I'm just so grateful to tell my story while I'm still alert enough to tell it.